and maybe tell you some of the stories of my experiences in rural Idaho and working throughout rural Idaho with my clinic. Now, just as a little bit of a perspective about me, you heard that there's a lot of California on my resume. I spent almost 11 years in school and working in California, both the urban and rural environments there. And I also have spent the last 3 years in working primarily with the clinic in rural Idaho, which is a very rural place. To give you a sense, Idaho is one of the largest states in the country, and it has a population of about 1.5 million. Okay, so, and about half of that's in Boise. So when we're talking rural, we're talking really, really rural. Okay, and so you can think of the most rural place in Kansas and then Dublin, right? And that's about what we're talking about. So I initially started out, when I got this invitation, I thought maybe I would just come and tell you a story or something, you know, like life in the crazy rural parts of Idaho, which would actually be maybe more interesting than what I'm going to do instead. But what I'm going to do instead is to use some of those stories and as a way to try to draw out what I'm going to call legal institutions for rural economic development. And before I get to that, to those, I do, you know, I have this other hat that I wear, which in addition to being a law professor is my life as having done a planning degree and having worked a lot in the land use field, that I like to think about numbers, which a lot of lawyers don't always like to do. But and here's the part where I'm going to talk about some of the things that are similar to what Dr. Green talked about, but that I think will maybe fill in a little bit of what I think matters and why I'm going to make some of the suggestions that I'm going to make. Because there are numbers that I talked about and things that I talk about when I go out into rural Idaho. Because one of the things that I think people don't often think about when they're in rural communities is how connected it is to be rural, really, really rural. How much you have to be willing to engage with cities, and how much you have to be willing to engage with the world economy. So, because I didn't, this is sort of where I'm going to go. We're going to talk about the changing nature of rural America and its economy. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about just the history of rural economic development, simply to give you a sense of how what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit different than what people have historically done or thought about. And then I'm going to talk about 3 legal approaches. And these are actually kind of more out of experience, and they're things that I'm trying to sort of think about more globally than the experiences that created them. I'm not going to tell you that the 3 things that I'm going to talk about here will solve all the problems, but there may be things that you can take away and might work for specific communities here in Kansas. One is similar to what Professor Nolan talked about, what I'm going to call bottom-up planning, and he actually used a similar phrase, but I'm going to give you some examples to maybe flesh out some of that idea. The second is to think about the idea of agriculture itself and how we think about that in terms of planning and zoning documents and comprehensive planning. I'm going to make an argument that our agriculture has changed, and we need to think about how we zone that and how we think about that. And then finally, I want to think about this idea of how we identify, evaluate, and disclose the risk of rural economic development projects. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of things that have not gone well in Idaho. You probably can think of some in your own experience. And some others that are what I call bet the town deals. And how do we deal with the bet the town deal? What do we do about that? All right, and then I'm also going to talk just generally about some other things that I've seen going from California to Idaho that may apply in Kansas, but I think are just generally ways to think about legal institutions generally for rural communities. Okay, so rural America, what's happening, right? So one thing I think that I know that Dr. Green can probably talk much more about than I could, but one thing that's happening, right, is that for the first time ever, we live in an urban world, right? There's now, starting in 2008, the UN believes that that was sort of the date that it happened when the world changed from being primarily rural to being primarily urban. And that's only going to increase over the next couple of decades. So within the next by 2050, it's projected that there will be another 2 billion or so people on the planet. And believe it or not, in that same period, it's estimated that the rural population worldwide will actually lose about 300,000 people. So we're going to add 2 billion and actually take away 300,000 from the rural population worldwide. If you think about that, that's pretty stunning. Okay? And where are those 2 billion going to be? They're going to be not in Kansas or Idaho or even California. Most of them are going to be in developing countries. So when you think about global markets, right? One of the things, if you think about growing an economy, you want to have some sort of access to that 2 billion, right? So that's your question about exports and imports. Okay? The American rural community largely lost its population between 1900 and 2000, right? Just to throw in some numbers, in 1910, 46% of the U.S. population lived in urban areas. By 2010, 81% did. Okay, so a tremendous change there. But the interesting thing is that we can slice and dice that a little bit. When we look at non-farm rural populations, that number actually hasn't changed that much. And again, Dr. Green could probably tell us much more about this, but when you look at just some of the basic census data, in 1900, 23% of Americans lived in, were living as non-farm rural, were non-farm rural population. But what's really changed is the ag population. The number of people that are associated with agriculture has dropped dramatically. So in 1900, 41% of the U.S. workforce farmed. That was 16% in 1945, 4% in 1970, and 2% in 2000. So when we talk about a loss of rural population, what's fascinating is that loss of rural population is really about the efficiencies created by the agricultural sector. And I think that sort of ties in with what Dr. Green was saying, that rural economies are not ag economies anymore because ag has become so successful. It doesn't mean that ag isn't making money, but when you talk about jobs, right, the agriculture has become so efficient that it doesn't need the people, right? You don't need people there, like, doing rocks or something, breaking up rocks or something. All right, so agriculture, yes, it's certainly viable, but is it a source of jobs? It's not really going to be a source of jobs. And in fact, this is what you may have heard on the radio today, that the 2012 census data just came out today, or was it yesterday? I think it was, yesterday. And what did it show? It showed that, yes, agriculture, the dollar value of crops had gone up. The number of people entering farming had gone down. So it just speaks to the fact that that's happening more and more. Okay, rural economies are very diverse. I'm not going to belabor this, but because Dr. Green already talked about it. But one thing I do want to talk about is the way that rural economies are interdependent with urban economies. And I think there's two key components to this. One is that rural economies, if you look at small farms and mid-sized farms, a lot of these people are making money off-farm, okay? They're somehow interdependent with some other source of income that they need to keep in that small farm or that mid-sized farm. The second thing is sprawl, right? And oftentimes we talk about sprawl from the urban side, but if we consider sprawl from the ag side, right? There is really this sort of continuum between urban and rural communities that is happening in a way that, frankly, hasn't ever happened to the degree that it is today. There's much more interspersion of urban and rural environments, and that's probably only likely going to increase. Okay? So the idea that, I mean, I'd love to believe, as someone who's interested in land use planning, that somehow we would tame the beast of sprawl. But the reality is that in most places, especially those that are don't believe in land use regulation, or where it's very difficult, it's hard to see how that's going to change quickly. And then the last thing is that rural economies are as much tied to the global economy as are urban environments. And what do I mean by that? Remember those 2 billion people I was talking about? Somebody has to feed them. Somebody has to make stuff for them. Okay? Who is doing that? Well, one person, one industry that can do that, right, is agriculture. That is partly why the U.S. agriculture exports have tripled between 2000 and 2012. Incidentally, so imports have also grown because of trade deals and things of that sort. And if you look at, there's this increasing push by the Obama administration, and you'll see in whatever future administrations, Democrat or Republican, to grow rural manufacturing and let it have access to those international markets. So when we think about what is rural, I think that a lot of rural people, which I'll speak for the ones that I've had discussions with in Idaho, often tend to think of themselves as, I live like out in the middle of nowhere, you know? But what I try to get them to see is, well, no, yes, you live out in the middle of nowhere, but you're also connected, right? You are also connected to a particular place locally, you know, in Idaho, that would be, say, Boise or Salt Lake. What are your regional connections? And then globally, what are your connections to the global market? I'll tell you an example. Actually, some of the savviest business people I've met are Idaho ranchers. There's one guy that I know who runs a large feedlot, and he typically sells his head of cattle for about $1,500 a head. But he has this deal with this guy in Korea, where if he will accompany his best cattle to Korea, the guy will pay him $7,000 a head. Okay? The international market can work. All right. Rural economic development. Now, for some of you, this is going to be totally basic, but as many of you probably know, the background of rural economic development really is extremely federal, right? The U.S. Department of Agriculture started in 1862, and the Morrill Act, which basically started all these land-grant institutions like the one I teach at, University of Idaho. Is Kansas still in this? Or is it K-State? K-State's in there. So, you know, there are these, in the beginning of the extension program, right? So that's all dating back to the 1860s and 1862 in particular. So that's just one thing to think about, right? And historically, that was connected to and because of all the things that Dr. Green talked about, and that I hope we've added a little bit of color to, that connection just doesn't make as much sense as it used to. So just some other quick things, right? There are some rural economies that are booming, and those are the ones that are related to the so-called negative externalities of urban congestion. There was a study that was recently done, and all of this, I'm going to put, I wrote a paper with lots of citations and everything, so if you want these citations to things, I'm happy to provide them. So there's sort of three things that people have found are really driving rural development right now. One is negative externalities of urban congestion, the high cost of urban space, and rural amenities. So that's going to help your agricultural communities that are maybe close to urban areas and those that have some sort of rural amenities. If you don't have one of those two, you're in a slightly more complicated situation. Another interesting thing about rural economic development, right, is this sort of strange conundrum about why do we even engage in it, right? The number of studies have shown that individuals have better income, better health outcomes when they move to cities. Their children have better long-term opportunities. So why should we engage in rural economic development? Well, I think there's several reasons. One that I didn't put up here, but I think was actually great that was talked about this morning, was the idea of stewardship of the land, and that rural people actually have a tremendous connection to the land and can provide environmental benefits through that. But I think that the reality is that there are a number of ways in which people are going to just continue to live in rural areas no matter. And there need to be some benefits for them and some way to think about their economy. So what are one of the things that keep people in keep people where they are, independent of independent of rural or urban, and that's education. Enrico Moretti, who's an economist at Berkeley, just wrote a book called The New Geography of Jobs, right? And what he kind of looks at is that people who are, what he notes is that people that have college educations are twice as likely to live out of state when they're 30 than those that have high school education. So when if you have education, education is mobility, right? And so one of the things that if you're a rural, and the other interesting thing about education that these numbers just came out, right, is that the gap between those who have college educations and those that have high school educations is ever widening. Right? It used to be actually not that much back in the 60s, and now it's actually quite substantial. And that's probably only going to get worse, or that gap's only going to get bigger. So if you want to be a community that has access to some sort of wealth, you need to have a way to, I'm not going to say invest in education, but I'm going to say you need to be a place where educated people want to be, right? So it's a different way to frame it, right? But maybe that's a rural amenity, but maybe it's just a belief in opportunity, but there has to be something there that an educated workforce wants to be involved in. And then the last thing, some of these are kind of connected, but they're all just kind of random things to think about. The last is state politics. I think that recently in Idaho, the rural community, state politics is a level at which rural communities can, in some states, and it's definitely true in Idaho, have more influence than their numbers on the ground would otherwise have. For instance, Boise has, I think, about 55% of the general Boise region has about 55% of the population. And I was just counting it this morning, and I think it's about 40% of the political representation. So there's various things that, so Supreme Court precedent that are supposed to prevent that kind of thing, but I think it actually may happen in some places where rural areas actually have more representation and are going to be able to require states to help them. Obviously, in places like California, the rural areas would say that they're disenfranchised. So it varies state by state. Okay, so now let's talk then about some specifics. I wanted to think about specific situations that I had been in, and I wanted to then find a way to think about how this could be applicable, not just in the communities where I have worked, but that could be applicable to Kansas. It might be applicable everywhere. And one of the situations that I started reflecting upon was a rural county where my clinic was asked to do some work. And it sounded like a really easy project starting out. It was an economic development council that had just started, and they wanted to incorporate. And what they said that they wanted us to do was basically just help them to incorporate, right? How hard could that be? And so I said, okay, well, I'm happy to do that, right? It seemed like as I thought of it at the time, that's an easy win, right? I mean, we go in, we do this incorporation, easy peasy, and we'll walk out having, created an economic development council, right? Well, we get there, and we have some basic questions, right? Because there's no just like general economic development incorporation principle, and you have to think about, do you want to be a 501c3, 4, 6, whatever? And there's different things that those different designations are allowed to do. And we started meeting as a group, and we realized that after several meetings that we kept having the same conversation, and that conversation was, should we build an airport try to build an airport, because maybe somebody will come and ski at our local mountain and build an airport? Or should we have a $5,000 business plan competition, right? And this seemed like absolutely bizarre to me. This was the nature of the conversation, right? These two things are obviously completely different, right? The idea whether you're going to build a multi-million-dollar airport, right, it's going to require huge federal funds and federal subsidies, or whether you're going to have a $5,000 business plan competition, are like they aren't even in the same ballpark. It's not even the same conversation. But that was the conversation that they kept having back and forth between themselves. And so it goes to what Professor Nolan was talking about the importance of planning. And how do you do that? And so we started looking for models. And I'm going to talk to you about several, but I want to re-emphasize what Professor Nolan talked about with bottom-up planning. I'm a firm believer of this as well, that it has to sort of start from the grassroots, right? You need these people who are having conversations about airports versus business plan competition to have some way to have a legitimate conversation that prioritizes those different things. So one model that I like is what Colorado did. And you can look this up and Google it. It's called the Colorado Blueprint. After Governor Hickenlooper was sworn in, this was one of his strategies for how he was going to get, this is 2011, Colorado is still in the midst of deep recession like a lot of places. And he said that, this is from the executive order, this is what they were going to do. They were going to go out and they were going to talk with a bunch of people at the grassroots, and they were going to do it at the county level, and they were going to then roll that up into, so we're going to go out to all the 64 counties in Colorado and do these, and talk with them, right? Just like talk. And get people talking to each other. And then all of those were going to create plans. We're talking in nature about what those plans were. And then they were going to roll them up into 14 regional plans. Okay? And then they would roll that up into one statewide plan. I actually think this is genius, right? I mean, this is like, first of all, this is not rocket science, but it's also genius at the same time. Because I mean, maybe this happens in Kansas, and Kansas is genius. Like, I didn't know this. But this is actually like such a simple model that I have not seen any state, Idaho certainly doesn't do this. I haven't seen, I mean, we were talking about the fact that a lot of local governments, there's a high fragmentation, tremendous decentralization of power. And to me, this seems like a way to deal with that, right? A way to try to get people talking at different levels and to create action plans. And each of these areas created an action plan. And when I'm talking about an action plan, I'm not saying like, we shall hire an economic development director, like something really big, like, you know, we will make more money or something like that. They were like real things that you can go and do, right? And if you look at, like, well, the one that I like is Region 9. And it's a southwestern rural community in Colorado. And Region 9 is not it's not Aspen, right? Would love to be Aspen. But it has maybe Aspen aspirations. But it's not there. But what I love is this idea that this was written in gold. This is not a comprehensive collection of all-encompassing end goals for all of Colorado, but rather a first set of achievable objectives to undertake together. I mean, if I were to say what is wrong with a lot of like economic development planning, it's precisely that it doesn't do this, right? Is that it tries to be all-encompassing, and I just don't think that that's possible. But what is possible is to think about things that you need to do and try to create specifics. So if you want to see an example of this, go to Google, Region 9, you know, Colorado Blueprint Economic Development Plan or something like that. And you know, one of the things that they wanted to do in their community was broadband, right? They wanted to have better access to broadband. And they got down to really specifics as to like what are the speeds that we want to have, you know? Because this certain speed will allow people to teleport, okay? So that's one example. But now what's another example? Another way to do this, right, is to do, in some ways, what Mr. Nolan was talking about, which is to integrate economic development into comprehensive planning. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to see who actually requires this. And it turns out it's very difficult to find out who actually requires this. And so I can tell you that there are at least 6 states, and there may be more, that do require it. And that's Washington State, Oregon, Georgia, Delaware, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. The American Planning Association in 2002 published a publication called Growing Smarter, which actually gives a really good model for what you would, how you would integrate economic development planning into a comprehensive planning program. But to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not completely sold. As someone who loves comprehensive planning and loves land use, I'm not completely sold that economic development planning is best done in the comprehensive planning process. And the reason why is that I think that economic development planning is it starts out at least at a very theoretical level or a very aspirational level. And I think that because of the requirements of comprehensive planning, that can limit or maybe stymie some of people's ability to think aspirationally about the nature of who they would like to be. I'm still thinking about this. I haven't completely convinced myself of this. But I think there's some reason to have economic development exist outside of the comprehensive planning arena, but then at some point, as it becomes more specific, maybe the specific action plans do become parts of the comprehensive plan. I don't know. I'm still working with this and toying with this. If any of you have any thoughts about it, I'd be interested to hear that. Okay, but these are all examples, and these are places that you can go and look. And then if you're interested in how different states do this, you could go and look at these examples, and if they're in the article, which I'll post when I get back home. So, all right, that's my sort of 30,000-foot suggestion, right? And I personally like the Colorado model. I think to me it just makes a ton of sense. And if you look at how they did it, they both marshal the state resources, and then they also look at the local level as well. Okay, so now I have another kind of maybe slightly crazy idea, but I'd love to hear your comments again. One is that it starts from this idea that we talked about at the beginning, that small and mid-sized farms largely are making their money, frankly, off the farm. And to the extent that they're making it on farm, they're making it from things that are not related to the agricultural use. And I think there are also new ways that we want to think about agriculture and new ways that we want to think about the nature of that rural space that are facilitated by this the relationship to urban areas. So let me give you an example, right? A lot of people aren't that interested in agriculture. But if you say, what about food, right? Suddenly, people get really excited, right? I mean, there are like a ton of food law clinics that are popping up in law schools everywhere, right? Try to get someone to take an agriculture law class, right? It just doesn't happen. But what is the difference? I'm not sure that there's that much of a difference. But we're thinking differently about what is agriculture and what are those lands that are productive. Let me give you 2 examples that I think might help to prove my point and might help to convince you. One comes out of Tennessee, which is called Shore versus Maple Leaf Farms, and the other comes out of Oregon, which is called Greenfield versus Multnomah County. Shore versus Maple Leaf Farms, this is just a great case. I mean, if you care about agricultural areas or you're interested in agriculture, you've got to read this case. It's awesome. And so the issue here is really what is agriculture? Because this guy goes, and buys a 225-acre farm in the rural area outside of Knoxville. Okay, it's just south of Knoxville. And for a while, he has some cattle, some corn, vegetables, strawberries, and pumpkins, right? Agriculture, right? But he decides, a few years later, that he wants to engage in some other things. And each spring, he started hosting a so-called Strawberry Jam Festival. Right? And the Strawberry Jam Festival had a lot of activities. Strawberry picking, you could get face painting, rock climbing, there were inflatables. And then they started hosting a corn maze in the fall, a pick-your-own pumpkin patch, hay rides, antique shows, and then deciding that things were going so well with the Strawberry Jam Festival that they would actually have music. And they actually started having music concerts during the spring and fall festivals. So, is that agriculture? And moreover, in a state that has a Right to Farm Act, like Tennessee, and I believe Kansas does as well, should that be a protected use under the Right to Farm Act? And moreover, in a place like Tennessee, that has, Tennessee had an exemption that said that if you were in agricultural use, you could not be regulated by local zoning boards. So, for these two questions of right to farm and the agricultural exemption, is the Strawberry Jam Festival agriculture? Okay. And the Tennessee Supreme Court said no. But it's an absolutely fascinating decision. And if you go and look at the Court of Appeals decision, the Court of Appeals said yes. And why did the Court of Appeals in Tennessee say yes? Because they said the nature of agriculture is changing. For everything that we talked about today, they said farmers can't make it just being farmers. We have to think about agriculture as including other uses. And there's also an amicus brief there written by the Tennessee Farm Bureau, which also makes this argument. Pretty fascinating. The next case, Greenfield versus Multnomah County, just came out a couple months ago in Oregon. And it, I'm going to skip some of what Greenfield talks about just because of time. But one of the most interesting questions to me was that this is Multnomah County is the county outside of Portland. And Portland, if any of you have seen Portlandia, right, they love to know where their chickens are created and to know their chickens by name. And this is the case, this is the Portlandia chicken case. These people are on this farm in an exclusive farm use district, are having farm-to-table dinners for 145 people, 45 times a year. Okay? So, should that be allowed in an agricultural zone? And the Oregon Supreme Court comes down with the answer of yes. And it's slightly more complicated than that because it involves what is a farm stand. But the ultimate answer is that they hold that yes, you should be allowed to do that, and that is permitted use inside of an exclusive farm use district. And I think that these two cases tell us a lot about what's happening, especially with agriculture at the rural-urban interface. Urbanites are looking for new ways to experience agriculture. At the same time, agriculture at the urban fringe has tremendous economic pressures on it. What if there were ways that we could think about agriculture, redefine it in some ways, that would provide farmers new opportunities, like, say, farm-to-table dinners or things of that sort, that would allow them to have more on-farm income, maybe even more access to off-farm income, and maybe make it easier for them to stay in those lands rather than selling them for residential development. Something to think about. Another thing to think about is how do you define agriculture? And almost every county code or whatever is going to have one. Because of time, I'm going to have to skip a little bit here, skip ahead a little bit. But I would suggest Blaine County in Idaho, which is home to the Sun Valley Ski Resort, which is, of course, a tourist destination. But they actually have, I think, a really interesting and nuanced way of thinking about this and about alternative uses, some of which are listed up here. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is something that I've been sort of noodling over, which is how do you deal with the risk associated that a lot of small towns feel when they have someone come in and offer them the chance to save them from what they consider to be a desolate future. Okay? I'm going to give you two examples. So, all right, you aren't allowed to see that slide. I'll tell you what it says. The first example is Teton County, Idaho. And I'll give you an example. Some of you may have been, I'll just use it. Some of you may have been to the other side of these mountains, which are the Grand Tetons. On the other side is Yellowstone National Park. And just south of here is Jackson, Wyoming, one of the wealthiest. Actually, sometimes Jackson is actually the wealthiest city in the United States. A lot of New York, a lot of refugees from Lower Manhattan find their way to Jackson, Wyoming. So, this is, the idea was, hey, let's get some of that money to come over the enormous mountain pass, right? And we can become, like, you know, the next Jackson, right? And during the 2000s, Teton County, which had 4,000 people living in it, subdivided 8,700 lots. And they thought, this is going to be cool, right? We're all going to be rich, because this is a high altitude area. Agriculture is really rough here. I mean, it's not, one of the farmers that we talked to when we were out there said he had seen it snow every month out of the year. You know, it's a hard place to make a living as a farmer. So the idea instead was that instead of farming this, you know, we're going to sell it lot 9, lot 6 of you know, your fancy subdivision. You know, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to this idea. What happened, though, was that the county signed a number of development agreements. Oftentimes, the development agreements were literally 2 pages for a 700-unit subdivision. For any of you who do real estate law, I mean, you recognize that that's ridiculous and crazy, right? How do you even like get the terms in there and get the signature block on 2 pages? But they did it, you know? And as a result of those deals, the county became obligated for putting in infrastructure and maintaining infrastructure that now exists and pockmarks this community here. And the current economy after the bust is devastating. There's now about 6,000, I think it's around 6,000 now foreclosed lots. The area has been, what was once sort of this beautiful, pristine area, now has, yeah, I should have used maybe another slide, this may be too pretty, but it has a lot of infrastructure built into it that most likely will never be developed. Okay? So one question that I have is, how do you still allow a local government to try to engage in this rural amenity development while preventing this? Okay? And let me give you another example, which is not necessarily, well, I'll just sort of tell you about it. Twin Falls, Idaho, small town. I mean, again, like hard to describe like how rural Twin Falls is, but it's out there, okay? And they entered into a deal to create a $450 million Greek yogurt factory for a company, which you will go and find at your supermarket. And for a company that did not exist 5 years ago, you know. And it's interesting. I mean, literally, the value of this one facility is probably worth more than everything else in the town. Okay. Tremendous deals that they did. I put some of the numbers up there. They initially, and there were lots of variables in the deals. So depending on the size, but there's probably maybe $100 million in subsidies to this plan through tax increment financing, through various tax breaks. They bought a whey digester. Turns out the Greek yogurt has this weird side effect that nobody knew about, but nobody really thought about, which is that it creates this stuff called acid whey, which apparently stinks. And it produces a lot of it. They don't know what to do with it. And there's so much of it that they can't actually dispose of it through the water system. And so, this is one of my favorite quotes. A local noted, "I was raised on a farm that had 3,000 pigs, and we had whey. And it's not a bad smell at first, but when it gets hot, it ferments, and it's horrible." So, someone who grew up on a place with 3,000 pigs, that's saying something. So, anyway, I'm not saying that this is a bad deal necessarily. However, I think about the question as to, what happens if that facility goes south, right? Or we decide that we don't like Greek yogurt anymore. The company that owns that facility is just a major grocery chain, just said that they're not going to carry that company anymore. And so, what happens if another major grocery chain decides that? And should the government be bearing the risk of all that? Well, I think there needs to be some sort of state statute that would act as guidance documents for local communities in creating these types of deals. And the example that I give in the article is California's Development Agreement Statute. California's Development Agreement Statute still allows communities to enter into these types of deals, but it makes them think about things. It makes them say, with the development agreement, what's the phasing going to be? How does the financing work? If you're going to build in a flood zone, there's going to be certain other requirements. And I think it's legitimate for states to require local governments to think about those types of things, even if they still allow local governments to engage in those types of deals. All right, I only have 3 minutes left, but I want to talk just very briefly about the idea of legal institutions related to rural economic development, because frankly, my position is one of those. I mean, my position is one of these positions that both has, I still see myself primarily as training students how to be lawyers, but sometimes we do some really good stuff. And I'm not going to say that we always do, but I'll just give you one example that I think also speaks to the value that you can have in institutions like ours, like mine, and like those of Dr. Green and Professor Nolan. And also, I'm gonna close on this because I think it also speaks to the idea of rural communities and them looking at the outside world and then being open to different ideas. So the first year of my clinic, I had no idea about Idaho, so we just started looking at different things that Idaho was doing, things that could have been, things that could be there. And so I wrote, we noticed that Idaho wasn't engaged in new market tax credit financing. If you haven't done new markets or haven't thought about it, basically what it does is it lowers the cost of financing projects in low-income areas. Okay? It's more complicated than that, but that's the end result. It's got a 20% break on the financing, which is a pretty big deal, right? So it makes some things that might otherwise not be possible. So I said, well, hey, Montana's doing a ton of this stuff, Washington's doing a ton of this stuff, Wyoming's doing a ton of this stuff, why aren't we, right? Well, there was an email that was forwarded to me eventually that was sent to the entire Idaho legislature. Okay? And it says, please do not get too excited over the lack of new markets tax credits opportunities in Idaho based on the article by Professor Miller. The headline, Idaho's missing out on some investment tax credits, is misleading. It goes on to basically say there's no way that we can do these deals in Idaho. Right? And the last paragraph there, an NMTC project is incredibly complex and expensive to put together. Since we have gone almost 12 years since the program began without the CDE requesting or receiving a direct NMTC allocation for economic development in Idaho, probably indicates that it has not been feasible to do so. Kind of amazing, right? I mean, to write that to the entire legislature. It's kind of stunning. Anyway, soon thereafter, I got a call from the director of the Montana CDC who had been forwarded my article. And he says, yeah, it is really weird that nobody's doing these deals in Idaho. And here, we just had him into our class last week. Here's an email that he wrote to our team. About 3 years ago, one of your staff wrote an article. And it turns out that as a result of that article, they decided to start looking into Idaho. And guess what? These deals were doing. And as a result, they've done $27 million of healthcare projects in Rexburg and Coeur d'Alene, which you may not know, but those are relatively rural cities. And they're looking into doing about another $24 million project in eastern Idaho that's supposed to close this spring that will have 300 permanent jobs. Okay, now I'm not going to take credit for that. But what I will say is it shows the value of simply one small little idea, right? But also the value of being open to new ideas, right? And I think for a lot of rural communities, the idea of engaging with these larger and more complex systems can be really challenging. But to the extent that people are willing to do it, there's real opportunity there. And I think that this is one example that I've been intimately involved in where it actually paid strong dividends for that. So I'll end there. If there's any questions, happy to.